Hi everyone. We're going to briefly talk about dual sequential external defibrillation. There is a video demonstrating how this is going to work, but I want to kind of give you a little bit of a primer on what it is and how it's going to work. So traditionally, what do we do if the patient's in refractory ventricular fibrillation? Well, we have the initial shock, and then in 2 minutes, we shock again, and then in 2 more minutes, we shock again. And then, what we've been doing is we might change the vector up a little bit. And then if that doesn't work, we just kind of stick with it, and we don't do anything else. And for some of our patients, this has not been working. We've been defibrillating patients for over 15 times, or at least 15 times, without it working. So we need to change something instead of still doing the same circular thing over and over again. So what is that thing? That thing is dual sequential defibrillation. So there are different strategies that's looked at in the literature, different strategies for defibrillation. One is the standard anterolateral, okay? And then I know it might look backwards in your video, but it's not. And then the strategy we've been deploying, if that didn't work, is changing the vector. So put a pad here, and then on the back, there's another strategy. It's called dual sequential external defibrillation. And what that is using your standard placement, your anterior lateral placement, and then like we would do if we're changing the vector, we change the vector, we put the pads on anterior posterior, but instead of pulling the cable, switching it to a new set of cables, we leave both attached. We use 2 monitors. We attach a monitor to each set of cables. We charge both to the max energy, and we hit the shock button. Okay, that is dual sequential external defibrillation. When I say sequential, I mean the shocks occur in about 1 second, but 1 second between the first shock. So the second shock comes about a second after the first shock. There are multiple different theories as to why this might work. One of the theories is that the ventricular fibrillation is dispersed throughout the myocardium, and that while one particular vector may terminate a percentage of the arrhythmia, there's still a large portion of the heart that is still fibrillating. And that's true. That can be true regardless of if we're doing anterolateral or anterior posterior. So changing the vector, if it is a more focal, if that's a word, if it's a more focal ventricular fibrillation, might hit the more susceptible part of the heart, a larger portion of the heart. It might be more effective. But to ensure that we are covering as much of that we are defibrillating as much of the myocardial as possible, we're going to use dual sequential external defibrillation. So historically, we have used standard defibrillation. I think this pad might be over a little bit too much because you want the energy to go between the pads, but it's probably not bad. Dual sequential or vector change is when we put a pad here and a pad here, although our pad positioning is going to be slightly different. We're going to use a pad position similar to what they used in the study that we're going to review. Dual sequential is this, all right, using anterolateral, and our pad position is going to be the same, all right. First set of pads here, 1A, 1B. Second set of pads here, 2A, 2B. Okay? And I'm going to play this video of the study protocol and how they did it, and talk to you about how we do it might be different. For some reason, I don't think the sound was recorded, but you see them with the standard position here. It looks like they gave their final shock. They're taking a second monitor. So both sets of pads have the puck, but you only need the puck on one monitor. And you can kind of see how they're pausing for a pretty prolonged amount of time to place the pads, and we're going to do it in a way that I think will result in less pauses. So place the posterior one. Now they're going to place the anterior one. And you will have to lift your hands up a little bit for them to place that anterior pad, because it's going to sort of go under the hands. Right there. Make sure you have good contact. Resume CPR. Both monitors come on. Both monitors are being charged to 200. And just so you know, our new protocol, all energies are going to be at the max energy for adults. So they hit one, then they hit the second one. And again, in their study protocol, there was 1 second, roughly. Okay. And that is dual sequential in a nutshell. And this was one of the first dual sequential defibrillation studies to show increased survival to hospital discharge. And when I was talking to our medical director about this, we were trying to determine if we're going to keep the vector change in the protocol or if we're going to get rid of it altogether. And we decided that if dual sequential is that successful at increasing survival to discharge and more effective than vector change, let's negate vector change altogether, go straight to dual sequential. So this is kind of how I envision it working with our high performance CPR model. First shock, standard defibrillation, right? Anterolateral. Okay. Second shock, same thing. Okay. But at the second shock, after the second shock, I'm thinking this patient is a DSCD candidate. All right. So what am I going to do? I'm going to have the person on CPR resume. Okay. We're still pre-charging. We're still doing all of that. I'm going to have them resume. I'm placing the anterior pad. I'm getting it ready. Why am I getting it ready? Because after the third defibrillation with the standard placement, the standard defibrillation placement, after that third shock, I'm then having the posterior pad ready to roll that patient and place it on the back. And at the same time, I am sliding in the Lucas backplate, rolling the patient back down. After the third shock, resuming CPR. And then on the fourth shock, we're going to do dual sequential on both monitors. Okay, so again, it looks something like this. First shock, standard defib at 200. Second shock, standard defib at 200. But after the second shock, I'm placing the anterior pad, connecting it to the monitor. After the third shock, I'm still doing the standard defib at 200, but then I'm having the posterior pad ready, rolling the patient, placing the posterior pad and the Lucas, okay, and then rolling the patient back down, resuming CPR, and then on the fourth shock, so after 2 minutes, I'm going to do dual sequential. Now, after we do the third shock, as we're rolling the patient, someone needs to be looking at the monitor to determine if the rhythm is refractory or recurrent. And we have to pause after the defibrillation to determine which one it is. If it is recurrent, that means we've defibrillated the patient, but the patient stayed in that rhythm. They didn't go to asystole. They didn't go to PEA. Okay? If that patient stays in V-fib, then the patient is a candidate for dual sequential. If the rhythm did terminate to asystole, PA, or ROSC, well, if it was ROSC, then of course we're not going to do it. But if the rhythm did terminate, that means that it's not refractory. It might be recurrent. The patient is still likely a candidate for ECMO, but the shock is working. It is technically effective at terminating that rhythm. Therefore, we would not do dual sequential. So what about after that? We've got both monitors on. We've got both sets of pads on. Then I'm using see-through CPR. I'm trying to get a hint of what the underlying rhythm is. All right. If I'm not sure if the patient is staying in dual sequential or not, if I'm not sure if the patient is staying in refractory VFib, I can briefly pause after the defibrillation if needed to see if that shock is effective, or maybe my filtered rhythm is clean enough to be able to determine if that shock's been effective or not, because I'm only going to continue dual sequential if the patient is refractory. So continue dual sequential as long as the shock is refractory, and this patient is most likely a candidate for mechanical circulatory support. All right, so is this going to be challenging logistically? Is it going to potentially tie up a supervisor vehicle for that time interval for that patient? The answer is yes, it is. Fortunately, these calls are usually uncommon. We have probably about a handful of these cases a year, about a handful of patients that would be a candidate for dual sequential external defibrillation. But for that one patient, it could be extremely meaningful. And these are patients that, if we can just terminate that rhythm, this person can and should survive. So we are going to do a little extra for this person to try to help them survive and hopefully be neurologically intact. So I hope that this training has been helpful. And of course, I hope if you have any questions, you'll let me know. Thanks.